At the crossroads of U.S. Highways 59 and 69, just a few hours from some of the state's biggest cities, lies the quaint community of Lufkin, Texas.
Lufkin is a very small town, about 35,000 people. Everybody knows everybody, pretty much. I mean, there's crime there like there is anywhere else, but murders aren't a daily occurrence in Lufkin.
For 27-year-old Jennifer Holliday, Lufkin has been home all her life.
I'm a mom. I have a little 5-year-old son. I was working as an EMT. I'd been there for probably around, I don't know, almost 3 years. I worked 24 hours on and 48 hours off, and sometimes I'd work up to 70 hours on, long hours.
As a single mom, Jennifer has her hands full most days, which is why she's so happy her 18-year-old cousin Anna recently moved in.
Good morning.
Good morning.
I made coffee.
So you did? Why are you up so early?
I don't know, I just thought I'd get an early start to my day.
Anna was a free spirit. She didn't meet an enemy. Everybody loved her. There was nothing like Anna's smile.
So, here's the little guy.
Dropped him off at your mom's.
So,
I didn't want to, but I'm gonna be at work really late, so.
She had one child, Jonathan, and he was going on 5. Anna would keep Jonathan while she worked. And then she was fixing to start her classes at school, so it just worked great, her being there with her.
you're gonna go like that?
Yes.
Come here. Come here.
No.
Yeah, just
Why?
lipstick.
Okay.
Just lipstick.
Okay.
I promise you. You'll thank me later.
God, we loved living together. My son loved her, and she was like my little sister to me.
There we go. Beautiful.
I have your approval.
You do.
Permission to leave the house.
Go save lives.
I will.
Love you.
I love you too.
Around 1 a.m. the following morning, Jennifer returns home to an empty house.
Hello? Anna?
Jennifer worked hard at her job. She had pulled a double. Wasn't scheduled to pull a double, but she had pulled a double, and she had just got off work.
Hello?
Hey, it's me.
Hey. Where are you? It's almost 1 a.m.
That night, and I'd been babysitting for some friends of mine.
Do you mind coming to get me?
No, I just need to change and I'll be right there, okay?
Yay.
It was very late. It was way out of my way to go get her. Way out of my way. So I was tired.
Jennifer heads straight for the house to pick up Anna, who's there, ready and waiting when she pulls up.
Oh, thank you so much. I didn't know if you were still gonna be awake. I owe you.
Yeah, you do. I accept all forms of payment, but chocolate is preferred.
Okay, I can work with that.
They were just having fun, laughing, cutting up, listening to a new CD that Anna had gotten, just being typical girls.
You know what I'm craving?
Sleep.
A midnight snack.
It's past midnight.
Can we stop?
No.
Please?
No.
Please?
They pulled into the store so that Anna could get Skittles. They wasn't out drinking or drugging or anything like that.
Do I need to tell you how long I was at work today?
No, okay, I promise I'll be quick.
Okay. You have 60 seconds.
Hey, what you want?
There you go.
Oh, thanks.
As promised.
Thank you. Let's go home.
Let's go home.
But as Jennifer and Anna start out on their trek back home, they're not alone.
Want some?
No, thank you. I don't even know what that is.
It's good. That's what it is.
We were just listening to music and everything was great. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary going on. Nothing at all.
So how was babysitting?
Oh, it's okay. Nothing like hang out with your little one.
Yeah, well, he's perfect, so. What is this, the longest light ever?
The biggest and loudest bang you have ever heard in my whole entire life came from the left-hand side of the window.
Oh God, what happened? What happened to Anna?
It was so loud, I originally thought maybe a car had hit me from the side because I would have never thought a shotgun would have been, somebody would be shooting at me in my vehicle. That's what you don't think that, okay? I guess Anna knew what had happened and she kept screaming and screaming and screaming.
Jennifer, you shot us! Jennifer, you're alive! God, your army shot you! Oh, come on, I gotta go to one.
911, what's your emergency? Yeah, come on, just, saw this. Came by and saw it, please. Hurry up, please. Oh my God. Okay, where are you at, ma'am? Look in the back. Ma'am, where are you at? Oh, no. Are you in the road?
Lufkin Police 911 operator Stephanie Davidson is the one to take Anna's call.
Okay, listen, I need you to calm down and tell me where you are. Once I was talking to the first female on the phone, I was trying to get her to calm down. Cell phone towers are located in specific areas that have a GPS location. You have to be reassuring and calming and try to calm them down so you can get that information.
But just when Anna starts to calm down, something happens to send a new wave of panic.
Oh my God. Oh my God, he's coming back! He's coming back!
27-year-old Jennifer Holliday and her 18-year-old cousin Anna Franklin are on the phone with 911, seeking help after a violent attack. But trouble is, it's not over yet.
Oh my God, he's coming back! He's coming back! He's coming back!
She kept screaming and screaming and screaming. I told her, stop screaming, please, stop screaming.
Oh my God! Oh my God! Shut!
Hello? Hello? I lost her and I dialed her back. I was trying to find out their exact location. I'm dialing another phone, telling the county dispatcher to send a unit that way because I have some kind of disturbance going on involving a firearm and an injured person.
As county units set out to circle the area, the terror only escalates for Jennifer and Anna.
Whenever he shot the gun, she turned her head so it wouldn't get her right in the face. It got her the side of the head. I pray to God, please, God, please let her be okay. I can't tell you the emotion and the sickness inside my heart whenever we left in that vehicle And the scaredness and the, oh my God, that come up over me, you know? Put me in a truck and then I'm being separated from her and here we go. I have no idea this man, what he's gonna do to me.
As the crazed gunman takes off with Jennifer in tow, across town at the 911 call center, operator Stephanie Davidson is desperately trying to trace her last call.
I couldn't pinpoint at all where she was at. I just knew a general location, a generalized area. As a dispatcher, you try to have that closure and you want that closure, so you're gonna call that number back until you get a person on the phone.
Finally, she makes progress.
It was pinging or had a circle around the area of Highway 69 North and Highway 7.
Hey, I need you to send a car out to Highway 69, exit 12. I think I found those girls.
At 4 a.m., the dispatched officers hone in on an abandoned vehicle along Texas Highway 69.
Got a weapon over here.
I'll call it in.
The only thing that I remember them saying was that there was a passenger in the vehicle, gunshot wound to the head, still breathing, roll med unit, and missing driver.
Hey, we got an ID over here. I think this is gonna be our second victim.
Let's take a look around.
They were looking for the driver of the vehicle. She was missing, so they automatically thought she was either in the woods or she had ran to get help. So their main concern was to get attention, medical attention to the person inside the vehicle, and then call for backup.
But Jennifer and her captor aren't anywhere near the vehicle by now.
After he shot her, I was in so much devastating shock that nothing mattered anymore.
Miles away from her home, Jennifer is taken deep into a dark stretch of wilderness.
I had no idea where we were at. I had never been in this area before in my life. And I know there was not one house, nowhere on this road. He drug me out of the vehicle and drove me to the side of where the embankment goes down at. And that's when he raped me.
Incredibly, despite everything that's happened to Jennifer, she is still alive and could never expect what her captor does next.
What happened to you? You're bleeding, but what happened to your arm?
He raped me and then all of a sudden was so concerned about me bleeding and about then was just so friendly to me. I do feel like he was in some sort of a blackout or something, and then that's why the mood had changed like it did.
It's then Jennifer realizes her captor's confusion could bring her only chance to survive.
I was shot.
What, out here?
Yeah. I was shot by that guy, John. I was shot by that guy. Did you see him?
I didn't hear anything.
You saw me here, and you saved me. You're a hero.
I said, somebody shot me and you were gonna take me to your house to let me use the phone. And he just sat there for a minute and he didn't say anything. And I said, I need to use your phone. I said, I need to call an ambulance. I said, or you're gonna have to take me to the hospital. I said, but your house is real close by, isn't it? And he said, yeah. I said, so why don't you take me to your house so I can use the phone to call an ambulance? And he just believed it.
Yeah, no, we need to get you some help. Here, I'll take you to my place, come on.
I wasn't for sure how long or if it was going to last, or I didn't know if it was going to work for sure. I was just hoping to God that he would actually take me to his house.
27-year-old Jennifer Holliday has just convinced her confused captor to take her to a phone. The trouble is, the phone's at his house.
It's called Durham Cemetery Road where he lives. You have to pull into the cemetery to get to his house. You pull in and then down the hill, and it's a really old trailer house. And that's where he had me at. It was awful.
This way.
I just didn't know how long it was going to take for him to wake back up and remember. And I was scared to death he was going to flip back.
Just go ahead and have a seat there.
Desperate to stay on this violent killer's good side, Jennifer does all she can to convince her captor she's enjoying his company.
Why don't you sit next to me? I like having you close.
You are gushing blood.
I'm sorry. I don't mean to make a mess. Maybe, it would help if I had something to wrap it with, like a clean shirt. Thank you. Thank you.
I told him he was a hero. I said, everybody's going to think you're a hero. Thank you. I kept telling him, thank you so much.
You saved my life. I owe you everything. I really do. I hope we can be friends. And maybe even more than friends. If that's okay with you.
I loved on him and rubbed on him and told him I loved him. I was very concerned that he was going to not believe me about and put it all together, what was going on, and ended up just saying, wait a minute, you know, and he was going to end up just killing me.
But to Jennifer's surprise, her captor buys right into it.
You are very beautiful. And I could definitely do a lot worse, that's for sure.
Yes. Okay, yes, that's great, but I need to stay alive. If we don't get help, I'm gonna die.
I saw that he had a home phone. I said, I need to use the phone to call an ambulance so I can get some help.
Okay, if I let you call 911, you have to promise me. No police, only ambulance.
No, please. We need a medic and then we can be together forever.
He shot me, and he did it, and he just shot my cousin. They let me use the phone to call on him. Most people would never have done that, right? So obviously he was messed up to some degree.
No police.
No police.
What is your emergency?
Though Jennifer doesn't realize it, her call has been answered by a familiar voice.
Hi, my name is Jennifer Holliday and I need an ambulance.
I knew there was an injured person somewhere at 69 North and Highway 7. I only had one ambulance left for the whole city.
Okay, what is your location?
I I don't know. I'm with my friend. He found me on the side of the road after someone shot me.
The main thing for us as a dispatcher to find out is if you're still in danger. One, if you're in danger, what kind of medical assistance you need. If your suspect is still standing around you.
Someone shot you? And my arm is in half right now, but I'm in, what's that thing? And this man right here in front of me helped me out. I've got another gunshot wound. Same one. Lady, same one.
I said, I have been shot. And whenever I told her that, she said, I've got another shooting. And I said, no, ma'am, the same one. She said, what do you mean? I said, it's the same one. And when I said that, she immediately realized that I was the other girl that they've been looking for.
Okay, let me speak to that gentleman that's helping you, okay? How do you get to cigarette? Can I talk to him? Well, yeah, hold on.
They need to know our location, baby.
Yes, ma'am. Yeah. Hold on for me just a second, okay? Okay.
I knew that here he could be the suspect of this initial incident, and he's also with the victim. So I said, can you give me directions how to get there? I've got to send Jennifer, I've got to send this lady, an ambulance. So he gave me to the T directions, exactly how to get to his house.
What's the name of that road? You're on Cemetery Road. You're in Cemetery Road? Yes. Okay, is that your house, or?
Yes, it's going to be the one on the right.
The one on the right?
Yes.
Okay, let me talk to her.
Okay, all right.
Lexi, go ahead.
There's blood everywhere. Oh, my God.
He said, this lady's bleeding from head to toe, but she acts like she's perfectly fine. And yeah, because I had to calm him down through the whole thing because I was getting very thirsty because I had lost that much blood.
Help is on the way, sir. Now, the best thing that you can do is you can get her some water. Can you do that?
Yes.
Okay, and do me a favor. Can you turn the phone back over to Jennifer because I need to ask her some questions about her injuries, okay?
Okay, just get here.
Hello?
Did he leave the room?
Yes.
Okay. I'm going to ask you some yes or no questions. The man in the house, is he your friend?
No.
Is he the man who shot you?
Yes.
Do you know his name?
No.
I had a name on the address, which I just trying to see if I could find out who he was for my officers so that they knew what they were heading into as far as a criminal history background.
Okay, I have police and an ambulance on the way, but you're in a very remote location and it's going to take them about 40 minutes to reach you. Jennifer, now I want you to keep talking to me as though you two are friends. I want you to talk to me about your injuries as if that's what we're talking about, okay?
You got a towel wrapped around your arm? Is that where you were shot in the arm? Okay. I do not know. I do not know, ma'am. I do not know. Okay?
She would start questioning me up. Is my cousin alive? Do you know where she's at? What's happening with her? I know she's dead. I know something's happened to her. I know he shot her, da-da-da-da. And I would just have to pull her back. I would be like, Jennifer, I do not know the status of your cousin right now. I cannot tell you. I do not know. I know she's getting attention right now and help. What we need to do is get you back and get you help. And this is what we need to do.
Thank you, sweetie.
Is he back?
Yes, that's right, on the side of the road. He's such an amazing man.
It made me sick. I wanted to throw up. But I wanted to live, too. So I did whatever I had to do. But I wasn't going to get out of there being hysterical. You know what I'm saying? That wasn't going to get me nowhere with this guy.
Let me talk to her. Just let me talk to her.
I just started a rapport with him. You know, sir, I know you're trying to help this lady. You found her, keeping up the ruse that she had started because it meant her life. And that's what you got to do.
Yeah, I just, I found her on the side of the road. I just, did what any good Samaritan would do.
Must have been fate or something that brought you two together, huh? Sounds like you two are already pretty close.
Yeah, we are. We're actually talking about getting married. I'd say I'm a pretty lucky guy.
I'm the lucky one.
I kind of had to continue to play her game and play her ruse so it would still be fresh in his mind and he wouldn't have anything else to think about. I was worried that he would revert back to the state that kind of, per se, snapped to it and realize, what did I just do or what have I done? This is not a person that I'm helping. This is a person that hurt.
As first responders race to the home where 27-year-old Jennifer Holliday is being held captive, Lufkin police are busy getting to know the man who may be responsible.
Hey, it turns out house is registered to an Eric Parnell.
He had a record, harassment, threatening, stuff like that. And not that he was a hardened criminal or anything, but I just know that he had an agenda.
Got multiple counts of domestic violence and warrant for his arrest.
Sounds like a hell of a guy.
A lot of times somebody with a lengthy criminal history will have like an assaultive case and they're constantly assaulting people, they're constantly controlling people. That's their nature.
Wait a minute, did you see this? Said this guy was in an armed standoff with police for 3 hours.
You kidding? We better get in touch with first responders, let them know what they're getting into.
It's a long trek out to the remote location where Jennifer is being held, leaving 911 operator Stephanie Davidson on the line with Jennifer and her captor for more than 40 minutes.
She constantly would reiterate that he was doing a good job for her and helping her. She just played it well.
But when the ambulance finally arrives, the mood suddenly changes.
Okay, I see them.
What are they doing? They stopped. Why aren't they coming down?
Eric's looking at an ambulance. Eric sees an ambulance sitting there, engine running, lights on. Not red and blue lights, but it's sitting there with 2 people in it. And he's wondering why the ambulance isn't coming to the door, why people aren't getting out, why there's not a stretcher coming to get Jennifer, why. All these questions are going through his head.
Something is wrong. Something is very, very, very wrong.
Okay.
They're waiting for police, aren't they?
No, nothing like that. Nothing like that at all. They're just...
Shit! You police!
I knew that the ambulance was not going to come unless the police were there first. That's just their policy, and that's all ambulance policies. I mean, it's not safe to do so.
Hello? Hello?
You tell me right now why they aren't coming in.
They are. It's just protocol. Just hold on. They're going to be here any second.
Protocol? It's protocol to make a woman on the verge of death wait for medical help?
Your location is just a little tough to navigate. That's all.
Oh, okay. Hello? 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 Yes. Please send them down. I've lost so much blood. I'm not going to make it much longer. Please send them down.
I was very worried because I had thought that, oh God, he's going to know that I lied to him because they weren't getting out and coming down here and taking care of me like they were supposed to be.
You have to hold on, okay? You just have to hold on a little longer.
I was scared for her. I was apprehensive. I didn't want him to find out that law enforcement was coming and that, he could have shot her, killed himself. It's happened. I felt she was in more danger now than she had been in the last few minutes.
By daybreak Monday morning, across town, Jennifer's Aunt Robin Franklin is just getting her day going.
Hi. I'm sorry to call you so early, but have you seen Jennifer or Anna? Well, it's just that Jonathan's here, and I was expecting her to pick him up. It's just not like her to be late.
Between me and my mom, Jennifer didn't have to worry at all about her child care. She knew he was safe with one of us.
Okay, well, let me know if you hear from either of them, okay? All right. Thanks so much. Breakfast is ready, sweetheart.
Meanwhile, minutes tick by inside the trailer without any updates on the ambulance.
Stephanie was all I had to any kind of life out on the outside. It was very important for me to be able to talk to her. I had her. That was all I had.
That is until Jennifer learns that help has finally arrived.
Somebody cut through on the phone line when I was on the phone with Stephanie, and I guess one of the lawmen had cut through and asked me, could I walk outside and to the ambulance? I knew they were surrounding the house.
Look, they come in right now with assault over.
Okay, I agree. I don't think Jennifer can wait any longer.
You just never know what people's mentality is, and especially somebody that's in a delusional state. The old saying is you can lead a horse to water, but you can't make him drink. That's pretty much how this is. You have to be able to convince somebody with your words and your tone of voice that they're doing the right thing.
Now the thing is, the ambulance can't get down to your house, so do you think that you can take her out to them?
It's about freaking time. Get up.
What? Do you mind if I speak to... Hello? 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 Hello?
After losing a lifeline to Jennifer Holliday,
I lost her.
911 operator Stephanie Davidson fears what Jennifer's captor may do next. Outside the house where Jennifer is being held, police are now on the scene, anticipating their next move.
Inside in position. On my signal.
With this situation, the time was of the essence. 1, she was bleeding, her life is in danger. 2, we had cooperation from the suspect. I worried that he would stop complying, and then that we would have more of an in-depth hostage kidnapping situation, and that she could lose her life.
Then suddenly,
Got movement at the door.
police see signs of life from inside.
So I was very worried because I had thought that, oh God, he's going to know that I lied to him because they weren't getting out and coming down here and taking care of me like they were supposed to be. Here I am that close to getting to be able to get out of here, and then now he's going to think I'm lying.
But police have the whole house surrounded, and before Eric can make his next move, they swarm right in.
Freeze! Drop the gun! Drop it!
He was standing right beside me, and I was able to break away from him, and then they were able to make the arrest.
Eric Parnell is arrested on the scene. He's charged with murder, assault, sexual assault, and kidnapping. Free from her captor after a harrowing overnight ordeal, Jennifer is flooded by emotions.
No, wait, I want it off. I want it off of me. I want it off of me. I want it off of me. Get off, please.
The first thing I wanted was his clothes off of me, first of all. And I just couldn't believe it, that I actually made it out. It was the best thing in the whole entire world. I was just like, oh my God, you know, I actually was able to get away.
Jennifer is raced to the hospital, where she undergoes intensive treatment, but her thoughts are only on one thing.
And then when we got to the hospital, I know Anna was at the hospital, and I was praying to God that maybe he just hit her just a little bit, and maybe that she'd be okay, you know. When the police got there, they'll take her to the hospital, and that she'll actually be okay, you know.
Right away, Jennifer is hit with the heartbreaking reality. Her cousin is dead.
It took me a long time to get over just the look of what I had to experience. The last time I saw her, he had no mercy of how he killed her, you know, it was just awful.
Meanwhile, Eric Parnell sits in police custody, still claiming to be the hero responsible for Jennifer's survival.
Hey, I was just trying to help her, you know? I mean, that's what anybody would do, right? They see someone hurt, they help them, you know? I mean, ask her.
But officers have already heard enough.
911, what's your emergency? Yeah, come on, just saw this. Came by and saw it. Please hurry up, please. Oh my God.
Go away! Let's go!
Despite the evidence, Eric denies any wrongdoing. But there's little room for doubt about how things went down that fateful night.
No, I said put her on the phone. No, I told you to put her on the phone. Wake her up. I don't care if she's sleeping.
Eric Parnell had open warrants in the state of Washington for, he had held his wife hostage and he somehow ended up on a work release program and escaped from the work release program. We're talking about a sick individual, plain and simple.
No, you listen to me, okay? Your daughter can't just break up with me and then ignore me for a week.
He apparently had called his ex-wife, who had a protective order against him.
If you don't put her on the phone right now, you won't see tomorrow because I'm not waiting until then. No, don't you... Serious?
He told her he was coming to kill her, and the whole family went to his home, loaded up all of his firearms that he had with him.
But Eric doesn't go to his ex's house. Instead, he goes to a local bar.
Hello, ladies. How's it going? Why don't we go inside and buy you a drink, huh?
I had gone out with some girls and we were at a local bar and this guy, Eric Parnell, kept hitting on me and he was very intoxicated and he made me very nervous. I can't tell you why. It wasn't something that he overtly did. It was just one of those things that when he got near you, it made you cringe.
Let's go inside, the three of us, huh? Let's go ahead, it's right there. It's just a drink. Seriously? Just drink.
Rejected once again, Eric still isn't ready to call it quits on the night just yet.
Hey, what you want?
He decided to go to the local gas station, which is not far from his house. It's open 24 hours, where he encountered Jennifer and her cousin. Apparently her vehicle and his ex-wife's vehicle are one and the same, which I believe was a trigger to his violence. I think he put two and two together. In his mind, that was her, and he was going to inflict pain on her. It's just a wrong place, wrong time, happenstance, crossed paths, however you want to say it. I think her vehicle and his mind, state of mind, were all key factors in his actions.
Within days of his trial, Eric Parnell unexpectedly pleads guilty in order to avoid the death penalty. He's convicted and sentenced to 2 consecutive life sentences.
Eric wrote me a letter he gave me when I went to see him at the prison. And everything in the letter was blaming the girls. Or he had no remorse. He didn't know, he don't remember it, is what he said. She was my only daughter. The anger and the hate consumed me. Every time I thought of her, I thought of him. So it was just like they were one until I went to the prison and seen him and told him that I forgive him and that he didn't hold my mind hostage and never would again. And I've been okay. I've been okay since. You miss him more every day, but there's nothing you can do. So you either are okay with it or you let it take you down. And it took me down to a place I never, ever want to go back to.
For Jennifer Holliday, it's also taken some time to get past the loss.
Jennifer, she's been through things that I can't even imagine. I don't think there's a word to describe that kind of strength. It's a miracle that her arm is still attached at all. I mean, it was literally almost completely blown off. It was hanging on by a tendon.
It's kept me from being an EMT, the injury has. Of course, I mean, the main thing I've lost would be my cousin. Just immediate and total, just loss. It took me about 10 years to work through her death. It's where see Anna, or think about Anna, I see her, her holding, Jesus holding her and walking up to heaven. That's how I see her now. Stephanie has been an absolute lifesaver, miracle for me, you know. She calmed me down whenever I was absolutely out of my mind.
She's probably one of the biggest people I look up to in my life, knowing that I had a part in saving her life, much less that she saved her own life. She was raped, she was shot, she was beaten, all this kind of stuff. A lot of people don't have that gusto or that will to live. I think she had that will to live, and I think she convinced her attacker that that's it, I'm not going down like this. She did not want to die. And sometimes if you don't want to die, you will do anything you can in your power to survive.
There are murders that shock a city for a week, murders that dominate newspapers for a month, and then there are murders that disappear into the machinery of time. Names fade, witnesses move away, detectives retire, families grow older, evidence sits in boxes, streets change, buildings are demolished, and somewhere beneath all of it, a question refuses to die. Who did it? In Queens, New York, that question survived for more than 3 decades. 3 people were killed in a violent drug operation that called itself Black Rain. Their deaths were separated by months, but connected by the same ruthless world of narcotics, money, fear, and punishment. For years, the killings existed as cold cases. Then, decades later, the silence finally cracked. A man who had once operated inside that violent organization stood in federal court and admitted his role. His name was Jerome Shaw Jones. But before the courtroom, before the guilty plea, before the sentence, there was a different New York. A New York where a drug operation could generate thousands of dollars in a single day, where a street corner could become a business empire, and where betrayal could carry a death sentence. The story began in the late 1980s and early 1990s, along Rockaway Boulevard and in the surrounding neighborhoods of Queens. Black Rain was not simply a name. It was a brand. Heroin was sold under the name Black Rain. Cocaine was marketed as White Lightning. Crack cocaine was sold as Thunder. At its height, a single Black Rain location could reportedly generate between $10,000 and $15,000 a day. The money was enormous. The violence protecting it was even more frightening. The streets did not look like a battlefield. That was the terrifying part. Cars passed. People walked home. Storefronts opened. Children went to school. Neighbors knew which corners were dangerous and which apartments seemed to attract strangers at all hours. But beneath the ordinary surface was an organization built around narcotics and intimidation. Black Rain members were accused of using violence to protect their operation, and eventually, 3 people would die in circumstances tied to that world. The first was Oscar Flo. It was December 1991. Flo had allegedly stolen from a Black Rain drug location. The accusation alone was enough to turn suspicion into a death sentence. According to the later federal case, Jones learned that Flo had stolen from the organization. There was another detail that investigators would eventually connect to the killing: a sneaker matching a muddy footprint found on the roof of the location that had been robbed. It was the kind of detail that might sound insignificant decades later. A shoe, a footprint, mud. But in that moment, investigators believed it formed part of a chain of events that ended in murder. Flo was confronted. Jones and a co-conspirator shot him multiple times. Years later, prosecutors said Jones even boasted to an underling about the killing. The words were chilling because they reduced a human life to a message. Black Rain had rules: steal from the organization, and there could be consequences. But the killing of Oscar Flo did not end the violence. It was only the first of 3 deaths that would eventually become part of one federal case. Months later, another name entered the story: Robert Arroyo. By 1992, the drug operation remained active, and the area around 128th Street and Rockaway Boulevard had become one of the locations associated with Black Rain. Jerome Jones managed a drug spot there. According to prosecutors, Arroyo was viewed as a possible competitor and, more dangerously, as someone suspected of being a police informant. In the underground economy of narcotics, suspicion could be more dangerous than proof. A rumor could become an accusation. An accusation could become an order, and an order could become a murder. Jones allegedly recruited 2 men to kill Arroyo. They were paid to carry out the job, but the first attempt went horribly wrong. The gunmen identified the wrong man. They opened fire. The intended victim was not there. Another man was shot instead, seriously wounded but alive. Somewhere in the chaos was a terrible realization. They had failed. The target was still alive. The mistake did not stop the plan. It made the next attempt more urgent. On September 8, 1992, the gunman found Robert Arroyo near the same South Ozone Park area. This time, there was no mistake. Arroyo was shot repeatedly and killed. The murder would eventually become one of the central cold cases tied to Black Rain. But in 1992, it was simply another killing in a city already struggling under an enormous wave of violence. Detectives had a dead man. Witnesses had memories. Investigators had questions. And somewhere behind the visible crime was an organization whose members understood that silence could be as valuable as money. Then came Dorothy Taylor. Her death would complete the sequence of 3 murders later admitted by Jones. Taylor was connected to a Black Rain drug location through a dispute involving rent. According to prosecutors, Jones blamed her after a drug spot was shut down when she failed to pay the rent and city marshals padlocked the apartment. The accusation was not that she had committed murder. It was that she had caused the organization to lose a place where it made money. In the logic of Black Rain, that could be enough. On November 2, 1992, a gunman hid in Taylor's driveway. She arrived home. The gunman waited. Then he shot her to death. It was an execution carried out in a place that should have been safe. Her own home. 3 killings. 3 different victims. A man accused of stealing. A man suspected of being a competitor and informant. A woman blamed for the loss of a drug location. Each death had its own circumstances, but investigators would eventually see the same underlying structure. Drugs, money, control, retaliation, and a network of people willing to kill to protect it. But then the years began to swallow the evidence. The 1990s became the 2000s. The 2000s became the 2010s. The city changed. Technology changed. People changed. Some witnesses disappeared from investigators' reach. Some memories became less precise. Others became more valuable because time had stripped away the immediate fear. The Black Rain organization was no longer the same force it had once been. The streets around Rockaway Boulevard continued to evolve. Yet the murders remained. Cold cases are strange things. They appear dormant, but they are never truly dead. A detective can open an old file and find a photograph, a name, a statement, a phone number that no longer works, a report written by someone who retired 20 years earlier. Sometimes there is nothing new. Sometimes there is one tiny inconsistency, one forgotten interview, one person who finally decides to talk. And sometimes the case survives because investigators refuse to accept that time has won. The federal investigation eventually brought the Black Rain murders back into focus. The FBI and NYPD worked together on the old killings, examining the organization, its members, its victims, and the relationships that had existed decades earlier. The passage of time had not erased the cases. It had only made them harder to solve. The first major public breakthrough came in February 2019. Nearly 3 decades after the killings, federal prosecutors announced charges against Jerome Jones and Darren Hamilton. The indictment connected them to the 1992 murders of Anthony Lloyd and Robert Arroyo. Lloyd had been killed on June 24, 1992, according to the government, because Hamilton believed Lloyd had been stealing from Black Rain. Arroyo was the man whose death had already been preceded by the mistaken shooting of another person. Suddenly, a case that had been buried under decades of history was back in the headlines. The old names returned. Black Rain returned. Detectives who had never accepted the idea of permanent closure had new reason to believe the past could still be prosecuted. But the legal process did not move quickly. Hamilton was later found incompetent to stand trial, and the charges against him were ultimately dismissed in 2022. That meant the case did not unfold exactly as investigators had once expected. The courtroom could not simply recreate 1992. Memories had aged. Evidence had to survive legal scrutiny. And the central question remained, could the government prove the killings beyond the passage of time? Jerome Jones, meanwhile, had spent years living far from Queens. The man who had once been associated with Black Rain was no longer standing on the same streets. But geography does not erase history. In 2016, Jones was living in West Virginia when state authorities searched his home as part of an unrelated investigation. That search would become one of the threads in the long legal history surrounding him. The old New York case continued moving through federal court. Motions were filed. Hearings were held. Legal arguments stretched across years. And then the pandemic disrupted the planned trial schedule. The case had been set for trial, postponed, rescheduled, and eventually placed in a state of uncertainty as the courts dealt with extraordinary circumstances and questions surrounding Hamilton's competency. For the families of the victims, this was not an abstract legal problem. Every delay meant another year. Every hearing meant reopening a chapter that had never really closed. Cold cases can create a peculiar kind of grief. The victim is gone, but the ending never arrives. There is no final courtroom moment, no sentence, no definitive acknowledgement of responsibility. Instead, families are left with anniversaries, photographs, memories, questions, and a knowledge that somewhere the person responsible may still be alive. Then in August 2024, the story changed again. Jerome Shaw Jones pleaded guilty in federal court in Brooklyn to murder while engaged in narcotics trafficking for his role in the killing of Oscar Flo. But his plea went beyond one victim. As part of the proceedings, Jones admitted his involvement in the murders of Robert Arroyo and Dorothy Taylor as well. 3 cold case killings, 3 victims, more than 30 years of distance between the crimes and the admission. The silence had finally been broken by the person who prosecutors said had helped create it. The details were stark. Flo had allegedly been killed after being accused of stealing from Black Rain. Arroyo had been targeted because Jones believed he was a competitor and a police informant. Taylor had been targeted because Jones blamed her for the closure of a drug location. And the pattern became painfully clear. The murders were not random acts of street violence. According to the federal case, they were connected to the protection of a narcotics operation. The organization made money. The organization enforced its rules. And human beings became expendable whenever leaders believed their business was threatened. For the families, the guilty plea carried a strange weight. It could not bring anyone back. It could not restore the years lost. It could not erase the violence or answer every question surrounding the wider organization. But it did something that decades of uncertainty could not. It placed responsibility into the official record. A cold case had become a criminal conviction pathway. The past was no longer only a collection of allegations and unanswered questions. It had entered the courtroom. Jones faced a potential sentence of 20 years to life when he pleaded guilty. And the investigation demonstrated something that law enforcement had repeated for years. Time does not automatically destroy a murder case. Sometimes it makes the case harder. Sometimes it makes it slower. But a case can remain alive as long as investigators continue looking. The Black Rain investigation also showed the importance of cooperation between agencies. The FBI, NYPD, federal prosecutors, and the Queens District Attorney's Office all played roles in the long pursuit of accountability. It was not one dramatic clue suddenly appearing from nowhere. It was years of investigative work, old information being reconsidered, witnesses and records being revisited, and prosecutors building a case strong enough to survive decades of history. And then came March 18th, 2025. Nearly 34 years after Oscar Flo was killed, more than 32 years after Robert Arroyo was murdered, and more than 32 years after Dorothy Taylor was shot in her driveway, Jerome Jones stood before a federal judge in Brooklyn. The sentence was 30 years in prison. The courtroom had reached the point the victims' families had waited for. There would be no more speculation about whether Jones would face punishment for the 3 killings. He had admitted his role, and the judge imposed the sentence. The man who had once operated in the Black Rain drug world was now entering another kind of system, one defined by prison walls instead of drug spots, federal courtrooms instead of street corners, and legal judgment instead of violence. The distance between 1991 and 2025 was enormous. A generation had passed. Children had grown up. Neighborhoods had changed. The people who remembered the original killings had aged. Yet the names of the victims remained. Oscar Flo, Robert Arroyo, Dorothy Taylor. 3 people whose lives have been reduced, for decades, to lines in old case files. 3 deaths that had become part of a larger story about a drug organization that once operated in Queens. And 3 families who had spent years waiting for the justice system to catch up with history. But there is something haunting about the Black Rain case that a prison sentence cannot erase. It is the scale of time. Imagine hearing the news in 1992 and being told that the case might still be discussed decades later. Imagine walking through the same neighborhood knowing someone you loved had died there, while the world around you continued moving. Imagine watching newspapers change from paper to digital, watching technology transform investigations, watching entire generations enter adulthood, while one question remains frozen in the past. That is what makes a cold case different from an ordinary investigation. The crime happens in one moment. The consequences can last a lifetime. In the early 1990s, Black Rain reportedly generated enormous profits from heroin, cocaine, and crack. The operation depended on fear. But fear has a weakness. It depends on silence. And silence becomes harder to maintain as years pass. People move. Relationships change. Loyalties fracture. Memories return. Investigators get another chance. A person who was once afraid may eventually decide that enough time has passed. A person who once protected someone may no longer have a reason to remain silent. The organization that once seemed powerful can disappear. The only thing left is the evidence. The story of Robert Arroyo is particularly disturbing because of the first failed attempt. Someone had been mistaken for him and shot. That person survived. The intended target did not. It is a detail that reveals the machinery of the killing. There was planning. There were recruits. There was money. There was an objective. Yet even the killers did not know exactly who they were shooting until they were certain enough to pull the trigger. The story of Dorothy Taylor is different, but perhaps just as unsettling. She was not described as a rival drug trafficker. She was blamed for the loss of a drug location. The punishment came anyway. The story of Oscar Flo is different again. A theft allegedly led to accusations, confrontation, and murder. 3 circumstances, 3 victims, 1 underlying culture of violence. The federal case ultimately brought these separate stories together through Jones's admissions. And that is where the Black Rain case stops being merely a collection of old murders and becomes a warning about how criminal organizations operate. When money becomes the highest value, people become obstacles. When fear becomes the enforcement mechanism, violence becomes policy. And when violence becomes routine, murder can begin to feel like business. The sentence in 2025 did not rewrite the past. It did not make the victims young again. It did not return the missing years to their families. It did not answer every question about every person connected to Black Rain. It simply established a final legal consequence for one man's admitted involvement in 3 murders. That distinction matters. Justice is not time travel. A conviction cannot undo a killing. It can only acknowledge what happened and impose a consequence on the person responsible. Yet for cold case investigations, that acknowledgement can be profound. For decades, the names existed without an ending. Then the federal court provided one. Jones was sentenced to 30 years. The organization that once operated along Rockaway Boulevard had long since lost its power. The drug brands that once carried menace, Black Rain, White Lightning, Thunder, became evidence of a vanished era. But the victims did not vanish with the organization. Their names remained. And perhaps that is the final mystery of a case like this. Not who controlled the corners. Not how much money changed hands. Not how many people knew what was happening. The deepest question is why some memories survive while others disappear. Why does one case suddenly return after 30 years? Why does one investigator open an old file while another person has already accepted that the past is gone? Why does one witness remain silent for decades and then speak? Why does a man who once lived inside a world built on fear eventually stand in a courtroom and admit what he did? There may never be a single answer. Human beings do not move through time in straight lines. Guilt changes, fear changes, loyalty changes, people age, and sometimes the weight of an old crime becomes heavier than the fear that once protected it. The Black Rain murders began in an era of enormous street-level narcotics profits and brutal enforcement. They survived as cold cases through decades of change. They returned to public attention in 2019. They moved through a complicated federal prosecution. And in 2024, one of the men at the center of the case admitted his role in 3 killings. In 2025, the court delivered the sentence. But somewhere in Queens, the streets remember differently. A corner that once carried danger may now look ordinary. A building connected to an old drug operation may no longer resemble the place described in police files. People passing through may know nothing about the history beneath their feet. That is how cities survive. They rebuild over their own scars. Yet every cold case leaves a kind of invisible architecture. A murder scene becomes a report. A report becomes a file. A file becomes an archive. An archive becomes a forgotten box. Then one day someone opens it. And suddenly, the dead speak again through photographs, interviews, evidence, and testimony. Oscar Flo, Robert Arroyo, Dorothy Taylor. Their names traveled across more than 3 decades before finally reaching a courtroom where responsibility was acknowledged. The reign that once gave the organization its name is gone. The drug empire is gone. The old hierarchy is gone. But the consequences remain. 30 years in federal prison for Jerome Shaw Jones. A permanent record of 3 murders. And a reminder that a case can sleep for decades without ever truly dying. The most frightening thing about the Black Rain story is not that it took so long to reach court. It is that for the people living through it, there was once nothing mysterious about the danger. The violence was real. The money was real. The fear was real. What became mysterious was everything that happened afterward. The silence, the passage of time, the unanswered questions, and the possibility that the truth might never return. But it did return, not as a dramatic midnight confession in a dark room, not as a single piece of evidence that suddenly solved everything. It returned slowly, through investigators who kept looking, prosecutors who kept building, and a defendant who eventually admitted what he had done. That is how some cold cases end, not with a perfect ending, not with every mystery solved, but with one door finally closing. 3 lives were taken in the shadow of a drug organization that believed violence could protect its profits. More than 3 decades later, the law finally answered that violence with a sentence. And when the courtroom doors closed behind Jerome Jones, the Black Rain story entered another kind of silence. This time, it was not the silence of fear. It was the silence that comes after judgment. The silence left when the questions that once haunted a city have finally found an answer. 3 murders, 3 victims, more than 30 years, 1 confession, 1 sentence, and a cold case that proved the past can remain buried for a very long time. But buried does not always mean forgotten. In the winter of 1991, Queens was a place where darkness arrived early, and on certain streets, darkness meant more than the absence of sunlight. It meant closed blinds, empty sidewalks, cars moving slowly past corners where men watched from doorways. It meant conversations that stopped when strangers approached. It meant people learning which questions were safe to ask and which questions could get them killed. The Black Rain drug crew understood that atmosphere. They operated inside it. They depended on it. Their power did not come only from the drugs they sold. It came from the belief that they could punish anyone who threatened the business and that nobody would be willing to challenge them. Money moved quickly. Heroin, cocaine, crack. Thousands of dollars could pass through a single location in a single day. And when that kind of money is controlled by people who believe violence is a legitimate business tool, every disagreement can become a potential death sentence. Oscar Flo was caught inside that world. The accusation was simple. He had stolen from Black Rain. But in an organization built on control, theft was not treated as an ordinary crime. It was betrayal, and betrayal demanded a response. Investigators would later reconstruct the events surrounding Flo's death and connect them to Jerome Shaw Jones. There was a drug location. There was a robbery. There was a muddy footprint on a roof. And there was a sneaker that investigators believed matched that footprint. On paper, it might have looked like a small piece of physical evidence. In the real world of the investigation, it was something else. It was a thread. Pull that thread, and an entire network began to emerge. The people involved did not advertise themselves as an organized criminal enterprise in the traditional sense. There were no corporate offices, no official contracts, no boardrooms. Their structure existed through relationships. Dealers knew suppliers. Enforcers knew dealers. People who controlled locations knew who could be trusted. And people who were suspected of stealing learned very quickly that trust had limits. Flo's death became one of those moments when the internal rules of Black Rain were allegedly enforced with bullets. According to the later federal case, Jones and another man confronted Flo and shot him multiple times. There was no courtroom that night, no trial, no opportunity for the accusation to be challenged. The organization had already decided what the punishment would be. That was the frightening logic of the street. A suspicion could become an accusation. An accusation could become an order. An order could become a murder. And afterward, silence became part of the crime. The killing of Flo did not make the street stop. There was no dramatic moment when the neighborhood suddenly understood that a criminal organization had crossed an invisible line. The people who knew were often the same people who understood the cost of talking. Others knew only that another person was dead. That is one of the most difficult things about reconstructing a decades-old murder. The crime itself may have lasted only seconds. The consequences can last generations. The investigation continued. But the world around the case kept changing. The early 1990s became the middle of the decade. The middle of the decade became the end. Cell phones changed. Computers changed. Police technology changed. Neighborhoods changed. People who had once been teenagers became parents and grandparents. Some witnesses died. Others moved. Some memories became sharper because time forced people to revisit them. Others became blurred. And still, the name Black Rain remained buried in old investigative records. Then came Robert Arroyo. His story exposed something even more disturbing about the organization. Arroyo was believed by Jones to be a competitor and, according to prosecutors, possibly a police informant. That suspicion placed him in immediate danger. In the world surrounding Black Rain, the possibility of someone cooperating with law enforcement could be treated as a threat to the entire operation. Jones allegedly decided that Arroyo had to die. But killing someone required more than an order. It required people willing to carry it out. 2 men were recruited. They were sent to find Arroyo. And then the plan went wrong. The gunman approached a man they believed was the target. They opened fire, but they had the wrong person. The victim survived. The mistake should have ended the operation. Instead, according to prosecutors, it became another step toward the eventual murder. The target was still alive. The organization still wanted him dead. And now the people involved knew they had failed. There is something uniquely disturbing about a failed assassination. It exposes the machinery behind the violence. It shows that the killing was not an explosion of emotion. It was a process. Someone identified a target. Someone gave instructions. Someone received payment. Someone watched. Someone waited. And someone pulled the trigger. On September 8, 1992, Robert Arroyo was found near the South Ozone Park area. This time, the killers did not make the same mistake. Arroyo was shot repeatedly. He died. The neighborhood continued. Cars continued moving along Rockaway Boulevard. People continued walking past storefronts. The city absorbed another murder into an already enormous wave of violence. But inside the case file, a connection was beginning to form. Black Rain. A drug location. A suspected rival. A suspected informant. A failed attempt. A successful murder. And somewhere behind all of it, according to prosecutors, Jerome Jones. Then there was Dorothy Taylor. Her name enters the story differently. She was not described simply as someone who had stolen drugs. She was connected to a dispute over a drug location. A place where Black Rain allegedly conducted business had been shut down after rent was not paid and city marshals padlocked the apartment. To the people who lived ordinary lives, losing an apartment because of unpaid rent might have meant eviction, financial hardship, embarrassment. Inside the Black Rain organization, prosecutors said it became something far more dangerous. Jones blamed Taylor. And blame inside a violent criminal organization could be fatal. On November 2nd, 1992, Taylor came home. She had no reason to believe that someone was waiting for her. But according to the federal case, a gunman was hiding in her driveway. The scene is difficult to imagine without understanding how ordinary it must have looked. A driveway. A house. A woman returning home. A person waiting in the shadows. Then gunfire. Taylor was killed. The three murders were now separated by time, but they were connected by the same world. Flo. Arroyo. Taylor. Three people. Three different accusations. Three different circumstances. One criminal organization. And one name that would eventually become central to all three. Jerome Shaw Jones. But in 1992, none of the people standing around those crime scenes could know what the future would bring. They could not know that investigators would spend years trying to reconstruct the organization. They could not know that the murders would become cold cases. They could not know that federal prosecutors would eventually revisit them. And they certainly could not know that one day, more than 30 years later, a courtroom would hear a defendant admit his role. At the time, the only thing anyone knew was that three people were dead. And the people responsible had disappeared back into the city. This is where the Black Rain story becomes darker. Because the most dangerous thing about a criminal organization is not always the person holding the gun. It is the system that makes the gun possible. Someone has to identify the victim. Someone has to decide that the victim is a problem. Someone has to provide information. Someone has to provide transportation. Someone has to locate the target. Someone has to create an alibi. Someone has to remain silent afterward. The killing may be committed by one person, but the environment that permits it can involve many. That is why investigators pursuing organized crime often spend years reconstructing relationships rather than simply searching for a weapon. Who knew whom? Who owed money? Who feared whom? Who had access to the drug locations? Who had reason to believe someone was an informant? Who suddenly disappeared after a murder? Who started spending money? Who stopped talking? Who knew something but refused to say it? Those questions can remain unanswered for decades. And decades are dangerous for evidence. People forget. Documents disappear. Buildings change. Records become harder to locate. Vittnessysteem. Some witnesses decide that they would rather carry a secret to the grave than risk reopening an old wound. Others finally speak because the people they once feared are no longer powerful. Time changes the balance. That may be one of the reasons cold cases sometimes come alive long after investigators believe the trail has gone cold. Fear has an expiration date. Memory does not always. The Black Rain organization itself eventually faded. The drug markets changed. Law enforcement strategies changed. Entire generations moved on. But the murders remained. And for the families of the victims, there was no moving on in the same way. A birthday still came every year. A holiday still came. An anniversary still came. Every year carried the same absence. There was no sentence. No courtroom closure. No definitive moment when a judge could say that the person responsible had been held accountable. Only questions. Why was he killed? Who ordered it? Who knew? Who helped? Why did nobody talk? Could the case ever be solved? Those questions can become a second crime scene. Invisible. Permanent. The first crime scene contains physical evidence. The second exists inside the minds of the people left behind. And that second scene does not disappear when police tape comes down. For more than 20 years, the Black Rain murders remained part of that invisible landscape. Then the investigation began moving again. Not because the past had suddenly changed. Because investigators had. Federal investigators began taking another look at the old cases. The names were no longer just names from a forgotten file. They were pieces of a larger narcotics investigation. The old allegations surrounding Black Rain could be examined with tools and perspectives unavailable in the early 1990s. The case was no longer trapped in 1992. It could be investigated from the future. That difference mattered. By the time the investigation reached the federal level, the world of organized crime had changed dramatically. Digital records existed. Databases had expanded. Agencies could connect information across cases in ways that had been far more difficult decades earlier. But technology alone could not solve the Black Rain murders. Because the central problem was still human. People. Relationships. Memory. Trust. Fear. Investigators had to reconstruct a world that no longer existed. They had to walk backward through time. And every step backward brought them closer to a city that many people had forgotten. The Black Rain drug crew. The old corners. The old apartments. The old rivalries. The old killings. And eventually, the old name. Jerome Jones. For decades, the victims had been frozen in time. But the man accused of helping cause their deaths had continued living. That contrast is one of the cruelest realities of a cold case. The victim's story ends on the day of the murder. The suspect's story continues. He can move, work, travel, build relationships, grow older, watch the world change. The victim cannot. For Oscar Flo, life ended in 1991. For Robert Arroyo and Dorothy Taylor, ended in 1992. But for everyone connected to them, the consequences continued. And somewhere in that long stretch between 1992 and 2019, the impossible question slowly became possible again. Could these murders finally be brought back into court? Could the old evidence survive? Could witnesses remember enough? Could prosecutors prove what happened? Could the people who had once believed the case was finished be wrong? The answer would begin to emerge in February 2019. That was when federal prosecutors announced indictments connected to the Black Rain drug crew and cold case murders in Queens. Nearly 3 decades had passed. The names were back. The old crimes were back. And for the first time in years, the possibility of justice was no longer only a hope held by grieving families. It was becoming a federal prosecution. But a prosecution is not a conviction. An indictment is not a verdict. And a decades-old accusation still has to survive the courtroom. The evidence has to speak. The witnesses have to withstand scrutiny. The government has to prove its case. And the defense has the right to challenge every piece of it. The past was finally entering the courtroom. But the courtroom would demand something the streets never had. Proof. And after nearly 30 years, proof was exactly what everyone was waiting for. By 2019, the city that had known black rain was almost unrecognizable from the city that had produced it. The corners had changed. The buildings had changed. The people had changed. But inside federal case files, the past had remained exactly where investigators had left it. Oscar Flo was still dead. Robert Arroyo was still dead. Dorothy Taylor was still dead. And the question that had followed those killings for decades was no longer simply who had pulled the trigger. It was whether the people who had ordered, organized, or enabled the violence could finally be brought before a judge. The passage of time had transformed the investigation into something almost archaeological. Detectives and prosecutors were no longer examining a fresh crime scene. They were reconstructing an extinct criminal world from fragments. Old names, old addresses, old statements, old accusations, old loyalties. And at the center of that reconstruction was the Black Rain Drug Crew, a violent narcotics organization that had once controlled profitable drug locations in Queens. The organization itself had faded, but its alleged crimes had not. They were waiting in the records, waiting in the memories of people who had survived the era, waiting for investigators willing to reopen questions that many had assumed would never be answered. The federal indictment announced in 2019 changed the atmosphere around the case. Jerome, Shaw Jones, and Darren Hamilton were charged in connection with cold case murders associated with the Black Rain operation. Suddenly, events from the early 1990s were being discussed in federal court. Prosecutors were telling a story that had begun nearly 3 decades earlier, when a narcotics trade generated enormous profits and violence was allegedly used to protect those profits. The indictment did something psychologically powerful even before a trial could begin. It forced the old story into the present. Families who had spent years hearing that the cases remained unresolved now had a legal document naming alleged participants. Investigators who had worked cases that once seemed destined for the archives were seeing their work transformed into a prosecution. And for the public, the phrase cold case suddenly became more than a headline. It became a reminder that some crimes can remain alive long after the people who committed them believe the danger has passed. But the courtroom was not a time machine. It could not simply transport everyone back to 1992. A judge could not walk through the old neighborhood and see what witnesses had seen. Jurors could not smell the streets after rain, hear the traffic on Rockaway Boulevard, or feel the fear that had shaped conversations at the time. They would have to rely on evidence, testimony, records, the words of people who had lived through an era that no longer existed. Every detail would have to cross the enormous distance between memory and proof. That distance is one of the greatest enemies of a cold case prosecution. A witness may remember the face, but forget the date. Another may remember the argument, but not the exact words. A third may remember being afraid, but struggle to explain why. And sometimes the person who knows the most has the strongest reason, to say the least. In organized crime investigations, silence can be currency. You do not spend it unless you believe the price is worth paying. For years, that silence had protected the world surrounding Black Rain. But time had changed the equation. People who once feared the organization could no longer be controlled in the same way. The criminal crew had lost the power it once possessed. Its members had grown older. Some had been imprisoned. Others had moved away. The streets that had once seemed to belong to them had moved on. And yet, the federal case faced another complication. Darren Hamilton was later found incompetent to stand trial. In 2022, the charges against him were dismissed. The prosecution that had once appeared to involve multiple defendants was narrowing. The legal path was becoming more complicated. One defendant was no longer going to stand beside Jones in the courtroom. That did not erase the allegations. It did not erase the murders, but it changed the case dramatically. For the families, legal procedure could feel painfully distant from the reality of death. A person is either alive or dead. A family either has someone at the dinner table or an empty chair. There is no procedural middle ground. But criminal cases exist inside a system of rules. Competency matters. Evidence matters. Constitutional protections matter. The government must prove guilt beyond a reasonable doubt. A decades-old accusation cannot become a conviction simply because the crime was terrible. And so the investigation continued through the machinery of federal justice. Then another obstacle appeared: the passage of time. The planned prosecution faced delays, including complications created by the COVID-19 pandemic. Courtrooms closed or operated under extraordinary conditions. Trials were postponed. The world itself had entered a period of uncertainty. And while the world waited, the Black Rain case waited too. 30 years had already passed. Now more time was being added. For an ordinary person, a delay of a few months might be frustrating. For a family waiting 30 years for justice, every additional month could feel enormous. The victims had not received the luxury of time. They had not been allowed to grow older. They had not been allowed to watch their children grow up. They had not been allowed to see the neighborhoods change. Their lives stopped. Everyone else continued. That imbalance is one of the cruelest features of murder. The victim remains forever at the age they were when they died. The suspect grows older. The detectives grow older. The witnesses grow older. The prosecutors grow older. Even the city grows older. Only the victim remains in that single moment. For Oscar Flo, that moment belonged to December 1991. For Robert Arroyo, it belonged to September 1992. For Dorothy Taylor, it belonged to November 1992. 3 dates. 3 crime scenes. 3 lives reduced to photographs and case numbers. And 3 families forced to carry memories through decades that the victims never got to experience. Yet something else was happening behind the scenes. The investigation was still alive. The federal government had not abandoned the case. The New York City Police Department had not abandoned the case. The Queens District Attorney's Office had not abandoned the case. Different agencies had approached the murders from different angles, but the objective remained the same: determine what happened and establish who was responsible. The old evidence could not simply be ignored because it was old. In fact, its age made it more important to examine. A document written in 1992 might have seemed insignificant at the time. 30 years later, it could become the missing link. A witness statement that seemed incomplete might gain meaning when compared with information discovered decades later. A name in one investigation could suddenly connect to a name in another. That is how organized crime cases often evolve. Not through one spectacular clue, through accumulation. One fragment, then another, until the picture begins to appear. The Black Rain operation had left behind such fragments: drug locations, rivalries, allegations of theft, suspected informants, people who disappeared, people who were shot, and people who allegedly carried out orders. At the center of the federal case was the theory that these were not isolated acts of violence. They were connected to the protection of a narcotics business. That distinction was crucial. If someone is killed randomly, the motive may disappear with the killer. But if someone is killed because an organization believes that person threatens its business, the murder becomes part of a larger structure. The structure leaves patterns. Patterns leave evidence. And evidence can survive people. The most chilling example was perhaps the killing of Robert Arroyo. The first attempt had reportedly gone wrong. The wrong man was shot. That meant the investigation had to account for more than the final murder. It had to account for what happened before it. Who identified Arroyo? Who gave the instructions? Who recruited the gunmen? Who paid them? Who knew the first attempt had failed? Who decided to try again? And why? Those questions turn a murder investigation into a reconstruction of an organization. The investigators were no longer looking only at the moment the gun fired. They were looking at everything that had to happen before the gun was fired. That is the invisible part of organized crime. The victim sees the final seconds. Investigators have to see the months behind them. And that was exactly what the Black Rain investigation required. Then there was Dorothy Taylor. Her death demonstrated another form of criminal control. According to prosecutors, Taylor became a target because Jones blamed her for the loss of a drug location after an apartment was shut down. It was not simply about a person. It was about a business location, a source of money, a place where drugs could be sold. When the location disappeared, prosecutors said Jones looked for someone to blame. Taylor became that person. The alleged decision to kill her revealed how far the organization's logic had extended. The target did not have to be a rival. The target did not have to be an informant. The target could simply be someone believed to have caused a financial loss. That is what makes criminal enterprises so dangerous. Their violence does not always follow ordinary logic. It follows the logic of the organization. Money is threatened. Someone must pay. A rival appears. Someone must disappear. A dealer steals. Someone must be punished. A location is lost. Someone must be blamed. The system keeps moving until someone breaks it. For years, nobody did. Then, slowly, the legal system began to close the distance. The federal case against Jones continued. And the more the case moved forward, the more the old murders stopped being stories from another era. They became evidence. They became charges. They became potential prison time. The man once associated with Black Rain was no longer merely a name in an old police report. He was a defendant. That transformation is enormous. A suspect can deny. A defendant must answer. A cold case can be ignored by the public. A federal prosecution cannot. Court filings create a permanent record. Hearings create dates. Arguments create transcripts. And every step forces the past into the present. Still, nobody knew exactly how the story would end. Would there be a trial? Would the government have enough evidence? Would witnesses testify? Would Jones maintain his innocence? Would the families have to wait even longer? The case had already survived almost 30 years. Another delay would not have been surprising. Another complication would not have been unexpected. That was the nature of the Black Rain investigation. Every time the door seemed to open, another door appeared behind it. Then came the moment that changed everything. Jerome Jones decided to plead guilty. In August 2024, he admitted in federal court that he had participated in the killing of Oscar Flo while engaged in narcotics trafficking. More than that, he admitted his involvement in the murders of Robert Arroyo and Dorothy Taylor. 3 names, 3 killings, 3 decades of distance. And now, a voice from inside the organization was acknowledging what had happened. The confession did not erase the uncertainty that had surrounded the case for years. It did something more important. It established responsibility in the legal record. For the first time, the story was no longer only an allegation from prosecutors. Jones himself had entered a guilty plea. The man who had once operated inside the world of Black Rain was now acknowledging his role in 3 murders. The past had finally spoken in the present. And suddenly, The question was no longer whether the case would ever reach a courtroom. It had. The question became what punishment would follow. A man who had once been part of an organization that allegedly used violence to protect its drug empire was about to face the final stage of the justice system. Sentencing. But before that sentence was imposed, there was something more important than numbers. There were the victims. Oscar Flo, Robert Arroyo, Dorothy Taylor. For decades, their names had been carried through a system that moved slowly. Now those names were about to be spoken again. Not in a police report from 1991. Not in a forgotten newspaper from 1992. Not an old case file buried in an archive. In federal court. And after nearly 35 years, the man who had once lived inside the Black Rain world was finally going to learn how much the past would cost him. The answer would come on March 18th, 2025. But before the judge pronounced the sentence, the courtroom had to confront the thing that had been waiting there all along. 3 murders. 3 families. 3 decades. And a truth that had taken an entire generation to emerge. On March 18th, 2025, the past finally had a date with judgment. Inside the federal courthouse in Brooklyn, the long history of the Black Rain drug crew had been reduced to a single defendant, a single courtroom, and a sentence that would determine how the justice system would mark the end of a story that had begun more than 3 decades earlier. Jerome Shaw Jones was no longer the young man associated with a violent narcotics operation in Queens. He was older now. The streets that had once surrounded the Black Rain organization had changed. The drug trade had changed. The city had changed. But the 3 murders remained exactly what they had always been. 3 lives ended by gunfire. 3 families forced to live with the aftermath. And 1 criminal prosecution that had taken years to reach its final stage. The sentence was 30 years in federal prison. 30 years. It was a number that carried an almost surreal symmetry. The murders had happened in the early 1990s. Nearly 34 years had passed since Oscar Flo was killed. More than 32 years had passed since Robert Arroyo and Dorothy Taylor were murdered. And now the man who admitted his involvement was being sentenced to spend another 3 decades behind bars. The calendar itself seemed to become part of the punishment. 1991. 1992. 1993. 1994. 1995. Each year marked another layer of the investigation. But a courtroom is not only about dates. It is about consequences. And in this case, the consequences have been waiting longer than most criminal investigations ever survive. When Flo was killed, the world was different. The internet had not yet transformed daily life. Smartphones did not exist. Digital surveillance was not what it is today. Information moved slowly. Police officers depended heavily on physical records, eyewitnesses, fingerprints, photographs, paper files, and information gathered on the street. When Arroyo was killed in 1992, the same limitations remained. When Taylor was killed later that year, investigators were still operating inside a world where a murder investigation could depend on whether someone was willing to speak. That last point mattered enormously. Because the Black Rain organization allegedly thrived in an environment where people knew that talking could have consequences. A witness did not need to be a member of the organization to understand its power. A neighbor could hear gunshots. A dealer could know where drugs were sold. A friend could know who had been threatened. A relative could know that someone was afraid. A person could see a car leave a crime scene. But seeing something and telling police are 2 entirely different acts. One requires memory. The other requires courage. And in an environment controlled by violence, courage can become dangerous. That is why the eventual federal prosecution was not simply a matter of finding one piece of physical evidence. The government had to reconstruct a network that had existed decades earlier. It had to connect people to places. Places to drugs. Drugs to money. Money to motives. motives to violence, and violence to the three victims. Every connection had to survive the courtroom. That is what made the guilty plea so significant. When Jones admitted his involvement, one of the greatest barriers in the case was removed. The government no longer needed to prove every disputed fact through a full trial. Jones accepted responsibility for his role. And with that admission, the three murders could finally be placed into a legal conclusion. But the plea did not make the story less disturbing. In some ways, it made the story more disturbing. Because the killings were no longer merely suspected. They were acknowledged. Oscar Flo had been accused of stealing from Black Rain. Robert Arroyo had been viewed as a possible competitor and suspected informant. Dorothy Taylor had been blamed for the loss of a drug location. Different victims. Different alleged motives. The same underlying mechanism. Threat. Retaliation. Violence. That mechanism is what prosecutors had spent years trying to expose. Black Rain was not simply a collection of individuals selling drugs on the street. According to the federal case, it functioned as an organization whose narcotics operation generated substantial money and whose members used violence to protect it. At its height, prosecutors said a single Black Rain location could generate between $10,000 and $15,000 a day. That kind of money changes the stakes. A lost drug location is no longer simply a lost apartment. A stolen supply is no longer simply stolen property. A suspected informant is no longer merely an irritating rumor. Inside an organization built around illegal profits, every threat to the business can be interpreted as a threat to survival. And when the organization responds through violence, ordinary disputes become deadly. That was the world into which the three victims disappeared. But by 2025, that world was gone. The drug crew was gone. The old power structure was gone. The men who once controlled corners had aged. Some had disappeared from the streets. Some had entered the prison system. And the locations where drugs had once been sold had become part of a different city. That transformation creates an eerie contrast. Imagine standing on one of those streets today. The traffic moves. People carry phones. Businesses open. Neighbors walk past one another. There may be no sign explaining what happened there decades earlier. No plaque. No warning. No visible escar. But somewhere in the history of that neighborhood is the memory of three murders. That is how violent history often survives. Not in monuments. In records. In family stories. In photographs. In the memories of people who were there. And sometimes in the courtroom. For the families, the sentence could never restore what had been taken. 30 years in prison cannot return a father. It cannot return a brother. It cannot return a mother. It cannot reverse a final drive home. It cannot erase the sound of gunfire. It cannot recreate the future that was stolen. Justice has limits. The law can punish. It can acknowledge. It can establish responsibility. But it cannot reverse death. That is why cold case convictions can carry such complicated emotions. Relief can exist beside grief. Satisfaction can exist beside anger. Closure can exist beside the knowledge that nothing will ever truly be the same. For families who waited decades, the sentence may have answered one question while leaving another untouched. Why did it take so long? Why did it require more than 30 years before the case reached this point? Why did the people responsible remain free for so long? Those questions are difficult because cold cases are rarely delayed by one single failure. They are delayed by time, by incomplete evidence, by fear, by witnesses, by legal obstacles, by changing priorities, by the simple fact that murder investigations do not always produce answers when investigators need them most. The Black Rain case demonstrates that reality. The murders happened. The investigation happened. The years passed. The cases went cold. Then the cases returned. That return was not guaranteed. There was no law of nature stating that 1992 would eventually become 2025. It required people to keep looking. It required old information to remain available. It required law enforcement agencies to revisit cases that many members of the public had forgotten. And it required a defendant willing to admit responsibility. That last piece is especially striking. For decades, silence had surrounded the murders. Then the silence ended in a federal courtroom. Jones's guilty plea became the moment when a case that had lived for years in the language of suspicion entered the language of accountability. The government no longer had to say only that Jones was alleged to have participated. The court could sentence him for conduct he had admitted. 30 years. The sentence did not erase the decades that had passed, but it created a boundary. Before the sentence, the case was still moving. After the sentence, the legal outcome had arrived. The distinction may sound simple. For the families, it was anything but simple. Imagine receiving the news that the person responsible for your loved one's death had finally been sentenced. Now imagine receiving that news after waiting more than 30 years. The emotional distance between those two moments is enormous. A person who was young when a murder occurred may be middle-aged by the time justice arrives. Children may become adults. Parents may die before seeing the case resolved. Friends may disappear. Entire families can change shape while prosecution remains unfinished. The victim's absence becomes woven into every stage of life. That is why the word closure can be misleading. A conviction does not close grief. It closes a legal chapter. The grief remains. The memories remain. The unanswered personal questions remain. But the uncertainty about whether the justice system would ever impose punishment is finally gone. Forflow's family, Arroyo's family, and Taylor's family, that distinction matters. Their loved ones were no longer only names associated with unsolved violence. They were victims whose deaths had finally resulted in a federal sentence. And there is another layer to the Black Rain story that cannot be ignored. The three murders were not committed in isolation from the drug trade. They existed inside an economy of addiction, money, territory, and fear. Narcotics generated profit. Profit created competition. Competition created suspicion. Suspicion created retaliation. Retaliation produced bloodshed. And once violence became part of the system, it could feed itself. One killing could create another threat. One threat could produce another murder. The organization could begin to resemble a machine that required violence to continue operating. But machines eventually break. Black Rain did too. Its influence did not last forever. Its members could not control the streets forever. Its money could not buy immunity forever. Its victims could not remain forgotten forever. The most powerful criminal organizations eventually discover the same weakness. They depend on human beings. And human beings make mistakes. Someone remembers. Someone talks. Someone leaves. Someone betrays someone else. Someone keeps a record. Someone refuses to forget. And decades later, those fragments can become enough. The Black Rain case also demonstrates why a cold case should never be judged solely by its age. 30 years can seem like an impossible barrier. But evidence does not always expire at the same speed as memory. Records survive. Investigative files survive. Relationships can be reconstructed. And sometimes the people involved eventually become their own witnesses. Jones's guilty plea was, in a sense, the ultimate example. The case had spent decades trying to establish what happened. Then the defendant himself provided the final piece of the legal narrative. He admitted his role, and the courtroom responded. 30 years. The number is long enough to span a generation. By the time Jones completes that sentence, the world outside prison will be almost unrecognizable from the world that existed when Flo, Arroyo, and Taylor were alive. But that is exactly what makes the case so haunting. The victims never got to experience that future. They were permanently separated from it. Their families were not. Their families had to continue living in it. Every year brought them farther from the night of the murders and, somehow, no closer to forgetting. Until the courtroom finally placed the past where it belonged. In the record. In the judgment. In the sentence. But even after the judge delivered that sentence, one question remained. Not about Jones. Not about the punishment. Not even about Black Rain. The question was about the 3 people whose names had survived everything. What would the world have looked like for Oscar Flo if he had lived? What would Robert Arroyo have become? What future did Dorothy Taylor lose when she entered that driveway? Those futures are impossible to recover. That is the final cruelty of murder. The law can punish the person who took a life. It cannot prosecute the theft of the future. And perhaps that is why the Black Rain murders remain so disturbing more than 3 decades later. They were not only acts of violence. They were the destruction of futures. The destruction of ordinary mornings that never came. Birthdays never celebrated. Conversations never finished. Families never completed. And all of it connected to a criminal organization that once measured human lives against money, territory, and control. The organization is gone. The streets have moved forward. The defendant has been sentenced. But the victims remain at the center of the story. Their deaths began the investigation. Their families carried the memory. Their names survived the years. And eventually, their cases reached a courtroom. 30 years after the crimes, justice finally arrived. Late. Imperfect. Unable to restore what had been lost. But real. And sometimes, in a cold case that has waded through decades of silence, that is the only ending the law can give. There was a time when the name Black Rain meant money, territory, and fear. In the early 1990s, the streets around South Ozone Park and the surrounding Queens neighborhoods were part of a city struggling with the consequences of an enormous narcotics economy. Heroin, cocaine, and crack moved through neighborhoods with frightening speed. Dealers competed for corners. Organizations fought over customers. And every location that generated money became something worth protecting. Black Rain had built itself inside that environment. Prosecutors would later describe an organization whose drug operation could produce thousands of dollars a day from individual locations. The money created power. The power created enemies. And the enemies created a constant need for control. In that world, violence was not always an unexpected explosion. Sometimes, according to the evidence presented in the federal case, it was a deliberate instrument. That is the part of the story that becomes harder to understand with distance. Today, it is easy to look backward at a cold case and see only the victims, the investigators, and the eventual defendant. But in 1991 and 1992, the people involved were living inside a completely different reality. The threat was immediate. The money was immediate. The consequences were immediate. Nobody knew that decades later a federal prosecutor would stand in a courtroom and explain how the organization allegedly operated. Nobody knew that old murders would become part of a major federal case. Nobody knew that a defendant would eventually admit his role. At the time, the only thing people knew was that people were dying. Oscar Flo was one of them. His death came after an accusation of theft from Black Rain. That accusation placed him directly against an organization that prosecutors said used violence to enforce its internal rules. Jones and another person confronted Flo. Gunfire followed. Flo died. The murder was not simply an isolated act of violence. It represented something deeper. An organization that sells illegal drugs has no legal court in which to resolve disputes. There is no legitimate contract enforcement, no civil lawsuit, no police protection for stolen narcotics, no lawful arbitration when money disappears. The criminal organization must enforce its own rules. And when the organization is willing to use violence, enforcement becomes deadly. That is why the accusation against Flo mattered so much. He allegedly took something that Black Rain considered valuable. The organization allegedly decided that the response should be lethal. And once that decision was made, there was no appeal. No second chance. No judge. No jury. Only a gun. The same underlying principle would appear again with Robert Arroyo. But Arroyo's case introduced another layer of fear. The possibility that he was a police informant. In the criminal world, few accusations are more dangerous. An informant threatens the organization in a way that a rival dealer does not. A rival may steal customers. An informant can expose the entire operation. Names. Locations. Suppliers. Dealers. Weapons. Money. And once law enforcement begins understanding how an organization works, the organization begins losing its greatest weapon, secrecy. That is why prosecutors said Jones believed Arroyo was not simply competition, but possibly someone cooperating with police. The suspicion became deadly. Jones allegedly recruited others to kill him. And then the first attempt failed. The wrong man was shot. That detail has remained one of the most disturbing aspects of the case because it reveals how fragile the machinery of violence can be. The killers were looking for a person. They found someone else. They fired. The victim survived. For most people, that would have been the end of the plan. A mistake. A warning. A reason to stop. But according to prosecutors, the failure did not change the objective. Arroyo was still the target. The organization still wanted him gone. And months later, the second attempt succeeded. Robert Arroyo was shot repeatedly and killed. That sequence transformed the murder from a single violent act into a larger narrative about planning, recruitment, and persistence. Someone wanted Arroyo dead badly enough to try twice. And that meant investigators had to look beyond the shooter. Who gave the order? Who recruited the gunman? Who supplied the money? Who knew the target's movements? Who knew about the first failed attempt? Who decided to try again? The answer to those questions was buried inside a criminal organization that had spent years operating through secrecy. Then came Dorothy Taylor. Her story was different, but the same machinery was allegedly operating beneath it. Taylor was connected to a drug location that Black Rain was using. The location was shut down after a rent dispute and intervention by city marshals. For an ordinary person, a locked apartment might be a legal and financial problem. For Black Rain, according to prosecutors, it represented lost income. A source of revenue had disappeared. Someone had to be blamed. Jones allegedly blamed Taylor. And then the punishment came. On November 2nd, 1992, Taylor returned home. Someone was waiting in her driveway. The gunman had positioned himself there. The moment Taylor arrived, she entered a trap she could not see. Then came the gunfire. She died. There is something especially haunting about that detail. A driveway is not a battlefield. A driveway is part of home. It is where someone parks after work, where groceries are unloaded, where children might run, where people expect the world to be ordinary. But that evening, it became a murder scene. Taylor's death demonstrated the terrifying reach of the organization. A drug operation could follow a dispute beyond the street corner, beyond the drug location, beyond the business. It could reach someone's home. That is what fear does when it becomes organized. It removes the boundaries people assume exist. The street is dangerous. The home is safe. The workplace is separate. The family is protected. Those assumptions disappear when violence is used as an enforcement mechanism. The 3 murders were now complete. Flo, Arroyo, Taylor. 3 lives. And after Taylor's death, the killings became part of the past. The investigation did not stop immediately. Detectives worked the cases. Evidence was collected. Witnesses were questioned. Suspects were considered. But the cases did not reach the conclusion investigators wanted. No conviction. No final courtroom answer. No definitive end. The years began to pass. 1 year. 5 years. 10. 15. 20. A cold case can become invisible to people who are not there. New crimes demand attention. New victims need investigators. New technology creates new opportunities. And the public moves on. But a murder case never really moves on. It remains frozen. The file may be stored. The evidence may be preserved. The photographs may remain. The names remain. And every anniversary brings the crime back into focus for the people who love the victim. For them, the case does not become old. It remains current. The date changes. The grief does not. This is why the reopening of the Black Rain investigation mattered. When federal investigators and prosecutors began connecting the old murders to the broader history of the drug organization, the cases were no longer isolated memories. They became part of a larger criminal narrative. The organization could be studied as a whole. The people involved could be examined together. The relationships could be reconstructed. And suddenly, details that had seemed disconnected decades earlier could acquire new meaning. That is often how cold cases are solved. Not by discovering something entirely new, by understanding something old in a new way. A name that once seemed irrelevant becomes important. A relationship becomes a connection. A statement becomes evidence. A pattern emerges. And once the pattern appears, investigators can begin moving backward from the crime to the organization behind it. The 2019 federal indictment was the public sign that this process had reached a critical point. Jerome Jones was charged. Darren Hamilton was charged. The old murders were no longer simply unsolved cases in Queens. They were federal allegations. And the government was prepared to argue that the killings were connected to the Black Rain drug crew. The case was finally entering the world of federal prosecution. But federal court is unforgiving. Every allegation must be tested. Every witness can be challenged. Every piece of evidence can be questioned. And a defendant does not lose constitutional rights because a crime is old. The government still carries the burden. That burden becomes especially difficult when the crime is more than 25 years old. Memory becomes a battlefield. The defense can ask why a witness remembers something now that was not mentioned before. Prosecutors can explain why fear prevented someone from speaking earlier. The jury, if a trial occurs, must decide whom to believe. That is the reality of a cold case prosecution. The passage of time can help investigators because people eventually become willing to speak. But it can also help the defense because memories deteriorate. The same clock can work in both directions. And the Black Rain case had been running on that clock for decades. Then came another twist. Darren Hamilton was found incompetent to stand trial. The charges against him were eventually dismissed in 2022. The prosecution was now focused on Jones. The case that had begun as an investigation into multiple people was becoming a case against one central figure. For prosecutors, this meant adapting. For the families, it meant another change in expectations. They had already waited decades. Now the legal process itself was changing shape. Nothing about the case was simple. Nothing moved in a straight line. Every apparent step toward closure was followed by another complication. That is why the eventual guilty plea in 2024 was so significant. There was no guarantee that the case would end that way. It could have gone to trial. It could have produced years of additional litigation. It could have created another chapter of uncertainty. Instead, Jones pleaded guilty. And with that plea, the story entered a different phase. The defendant was no longer simply fighting the allegations. He was accepting responsibility for his role. The old murders could finally be described in the courtroom not merely as accusations, but as crimes to which Jones admitted involvement. That moment must have carried an unusual weight. More than 30 years earlier, 3 people had been killed. Now the man prosecutors said had helped orchestrate or participate in those killings was standing before a federal judge. The world outside had changed beyond recognition. The phones had changed. The neighborhoods had changed. The technology had changed. But the victims had not changed. They remained exactly as they were on the nights they died. And the families had carried those memories through every year in between. The guilty plea did not bring the victims back, but it created something that had been missing for decades. A legal acknowledgement. And that acknowledgement set the stage for the sentence. 30 years in federal prison. A punishment long enough to consume much of the remaining life of a man who had once operated in Queens. But the number itself was not the most important thing. The most important thing was what the sentence represented. The end of impunity. The end of uncertainty about whether Jones would ever face punishment. The end of a legal case that had begun when another world still existed. And yet, even with that ending, the story of Black Rain does not become simple. Because the sentence tells us what happened to one defendant. It does not explain everything about the environment that produced the murders. It does not erase the culture of fear. It does not restore the victims. It does not answer every question surrounding every person who may have known about the organization. And it cannot give the families the decades they lost waiting. That is why the Black Rain murders remain more than a story about one criminal sentence. They're a story about time. About how long a murder can remain alive. About how long a family can wait. About how far investigators can travel backward. And about how even the most forgotten case can eventually return. The streets may forget. The city may rebuild. The headlines may disappear. But somewhere, the case file remains. And sometimes, decades later, someone opens it. When that happens, the dead are no longer silent. They are waiting. Waiting for someone to remember their names. Waiting for someone to connect the evidence. Waiting for the justice system to catch up with the calendar. And in the Black Rain case, after nearly 35 years, the calendar finally caught up. The calendar had finally caught up, but time had not been kind to the people who had waited for it. By the time Jerome Shaw Jones received his sentence in 2025, the world in which the Black Rain drug crew had operated was already history. The corners had changed. The technology had changed. The language of organized crime had changed. Even the way investigators built murder cases had changed. Yet the 3 victims remained fixed inside the same terrible years, their lives ending before the world could move forward without them. Oscar Flo, Robert Arroyo, Dorothy Taylor. 3 names separated by months. 3 murders connected by a criminal organization. And more than 3 decades between the gunshots and the final federal judgment. That enormous distance is what makes the case so difficult to understand. Imagine being told in 1992 that the case would still be discussed in 2025, that investigators would still be working the names, that prosecutors would eventually bring the case into federal court, that one of the men involved would admit responsibility, that a judge would eventually impose a 30-year sentence. It would have sounded impossible. But cold cases do not care what seems impossible. They wait. And while they wait, the world continues. A child who was 10 years old when Arroyo was killed could be in his 40s when Jones was sentenced. Someone who watched the police investigate Taylor's murder could have retired long before the case returned to court. A detective who first handled evidence might have spent decades away from law enforcement before seeing the case name again. That is the hidden human cost of time. Investigations are built by people, and people age. The officer who remembers a crime scene becomes a retired officer. The witness who remembers a conversation becomes an elderly person. The neighbor who heard the gunshots may eventually move away. The family member who remembers the victim's last day may spend decades repeating the same story because nobody else can carry it exactly the same way. Then one day, the phone rings. The case is active again. For a family that has waited 30 years, that call can be almost impossible to process. Hope can be dangerous after decades of disappointment. You learn not to expect anything. You learn not to believe every rumor. You learn that indictments can take years to become trials. You learn that legal problems can stop a prosecution. You learn that a case can appear alive and then disappear again. The Black Rain investigation went through those uncertainties. The 2019 indictment brought attention back to the murders. Then legal complications emerged. Hamilton was found incompetent to stand trial. The charges against him were dismissed in 2022. The COVID-19 pandemic disrupted the normal pace of court proceedings. The case continued moving through a system that was dealing not only with an old prosecution, but with an extraordinary national crisis. For families, that meant another lesson in patience. Justice was coming slowly. Again. But the investigators had something they had not possessed before. Time had changed the criminal landscape. Black Rain no longer controlled the same environment. The organization had lost the power that once made silence possible. And that mattered. Fear depends on proximity. If the person threatening you controls your neighborhood, your livelihood, your friends, and your access to money, silence may seem like survival. Decades later, the equation changes. The organization weakens. Its members separate. The old hierarchy collapses. People gain distance. And memories that were once dangerous can become speakable. This is one reason the passage of time can sometimes help cold case investigators. The same decades that destroy evidence can also destroy criminal power. A witness who once feared retaliation may eventually realize that the people they feared are no longer capable of reaching them. A former associate may decide that loyalty has no meaning anymore. A person who remains silent to protect a criminal organization may begin to see that the organization no longer exists. The silence becomes unnecessary. And once silence breaks, old cases can move very quickly. But the Black Rain case was not built only on one conversation. It was built through the reconstruction of an entire operation. Investigators had to understand what Black Rain was. The organization sold heroin, cocaine, and crack cocaine under distinctive names. Black Rain, White Lightning, Thunder. The names sounded almost theatrical, but the money behind them was real. Prosecutors said the operation could generate between $10,000 and $15,000 a day at a single location. That means that a street-level drug location was not simply a place where drugs changed hands. It was a financial center, a source of revenue, a point of control, a piece of territory. And when something threatened that location, the consequences could become deadly. This helps explain the alleged motive in Dorothy Taylor's killing. The dispute over rent was not simply a disagreement between a landlord and tenant. The location was allegedly being used for Black Rain drug sales. When the apartment was padlocked by city marshals, the organization lost access. the money stopped. Jones blamed Taylor. And according to prosecutors, a gunman waited in her driveway. The distance between the original dispute and the murder is what makes the story so disturbing. A disagreement about a property, a lost drug location, a person to blame, a decision, a gunman, a body. That is how violence expands. It takes an ordinary conflict and moves it into a completely different category. The victim can no longer negotiate. The victim cannot appeal. The victim cannot explain. The victim simply disappears. The same pattern appeared in the killing of Oscar Flo. The alleged theft from Black Rain created a dispute, but the organization did not resolve the dispute through legitimate means. The punishment, prosecutors said, was murder. And then there was Arroyo. His case showed the organization attempting to eliminate a suspected threat. The first attempt failed because the gunman shot the wrong person. The second attempt succeeded. That detail reveals another important feature of organized violence. It requires logistics. The killers need information. They need a target. They need a location. They need transportation. They need a weapon. They need timing. And afterward, they need silence. Every murder, therefore, creates a network of possible witnesses. Not just the person who pulled the trigger. Everyone who knew what happened before the trigger was pulled. That network may be why cold cases can remain solvable for decades. People remember networks better than they remember individual moments. They remember who worked with who owed whom, who was angry, who disappeared, who suddenly became frightened, who stopped coming around, who knew something that you should not have known. Those memories can survive even when exact dates do not. And investigators can use those relationships to reconstruct the past. The federal investigation eventually did exactly that. The old murders were no longer isolated. They were part of the same organization. That changed the entire meaning of the evidence. A statement about one drug location could become relevant to another murder. A name mentioned in one case could appear in another. A person connected to one victim could have a relationship with another suspect. The investigation could move laterally. Instead of asking only, who killed this person? Investigators could ask, how did this organization operate? That is a much larger question. And sometimes, larger questions solve smaller ones. The Black Rain investigation eventually led back to Jones. The federal government alleged that he had been a high-ranking member of the organization. The case connected him to the 3 murders. And after years of litigation, Jones chose not to force the entire case through a trial. He pleaded guilty. That decision transformed the final stage of the investigation. There would be no long jury deliberation over every detail. No dramatic courtroom revelation. No surprise witness suddenly pointing across the courtroom. Instead, the central fact arrived through the defendant's own admission. Jones acknowledged his involvement in the killing of Oscar Flo. He also admitted his involvement in the murders of Robert Arroyo and Dorothy Taylor. The 3 cold cases were now connected by a formal legal admission. It was the kind of moment investigators sometimes wait their entire careers to see. Not because a confession is inherently more important than evidence, but because it can finally resolve a question that has resisted every other method. Who was responsible? Now there was an answer. But an answer is not the same as healing. The families still had to live with what happened, and the victims still could not speak for themselves. That is why the courtroom outcome must be understood carefully. A sentence can provide accountability. It cannot provide restoration. 30 years in prison is a punishment. It is not a resurrection. The 3 victims remained dead. Their lost years remained lost. The family's decades of uncertainty could not be returned. The only thing the justice system could give them was a legal conclusion. Jones would serve 30 years. His involvement would remain permanently recorded. The case would no longer be described as an unanswered murder investigation involving him. The court had spoken. And after March 18, 2025, the sentence became part of the historical record. But there was another reason the case mattered. It demonstrated how organized crime can disappear while its consequences remain. Black Rain was once powerful. Its drug operation produced substantial money. Its members could allegedly use violence to protect their business. Yet decades later, the organization itself was no longer the dominant force it had once been. This is the paradox of criminal power. It feels permanent when you are inside it. It is temporary when viewed from history. The men who controlled corners eventually lose those corners. The money disappears. The organization fractures. The reputation fades. But the murders remain. The victims remain. The families remain. And eventually, the law may remain longer than the criminal enterprise ever did. That is what happened here. The organization disappeared. The case survived. The streets changed. The evidence survived. The witnesses aged. The investigation continued. And finally, the defendant was sentenced. There's a strange symmetry in that. The criminals believed they were controlling time. They believed that fear could protect them. They believed that silence could keep the past buried. But time did something unexpected. It weakened the organization. It strengthened the distance between witnesses and criminals. It allowed investigators to use new methods. And eventually, it brought the past back into the courtroom. The same years that seemed to protect the perpetrators ultimately became part of the story that destroyed their protection. That does not mean every cold case will be solved. Most will not end so neatly. Some evidence disappears forever. Some witnesses die. Some suspects are never identified. Some families never hear a confession. That reality makes the Black Rain case unusual. It had survived long enough to reach a conclusion. But the conclusion was still imperfect. One defendant was sentenced. Another defendant's case ended differently because of competency issues. The broader history of everyone connected to the organization cannot necessarily be compressed into one courtroom outcome. The murders themselves were resolved as part of Jones's plea and sentence. But the larger story of the drug crew belongs to a more complicated history of New York streets. And perhaps that is why the case still carries such weight. It is not simply about one criminal. It is about an era. An era when narcotics created enormous wealth. When violence could determine who controlled a corner. When suspicion of being an informant could become a death sentence. When a property dispute could end in murder. When a stolen supply could trigger retaliation. When entire communities learned to survive by understanding what not to say. That atmosphere is difficult to recreate today. But the case files preserve it. Every name. Every location. Every accusation. Every murder. Every delay. Every court hearing. And eventually, every admission. The Black Rain story is therefore also a story about memory. What happens when a city forgets? What happens when the people who remember become old? What happens when a murder disappears from the front page, but never disappears from a family's life? The answer is uncomfortable. The crime remains. It simply becomes quieter. The police tape disappears. The news cameras leave. The street returns to normal. But for the family, there is no normal. There is only a new version of life built around absence. And that absence can last 30 years. It can last longer. The case may sleep, but the family does not. They remember the victim's voice, the way they laughed, the clothes they wore, the things they planned to do, the life they expected to have. Those details rarely appear in an indictment. They rarely appear in a sentencing memorandum, but they're the most important details of all. Because a murder victim is never just a victim. Before the crime, Oscar Flo was a person. Robert Arroyo was a person. Dorothy Taylor was a person. They had relationships, habits, plans, people who knew them, people who expected to see them again. The gunfire did not simply end 3 lives. It changed the lives of everyone connected to them. That is the true scale of a murder. One death creates a circle of consequences. The circle expands through families, friends, neighbors, investigators, communities, and sometimes, decades later, prosecutors and judges. That circle can travel through time. It can cross generations, and it can eventually arrive in a courtroom. On March 18, 2025, that circle finally reached its legal boundary. Jerome Jones was sentenced to 30 years. The Black Rain case had reached its conclusion. But the sound of those old gunshots does not disappear simply because a judge has spoken. The past does not become harmless because it has been documented. The victims do not become less important because the defendant is behind bars. And the decades of uncertainty do not vanish. They become part of history. A history written in 3 names. Oscar Flo, Robert Arroyo, Dorothy Taylor. 3 people. 3 murders. 1 criminal organization. 1 defendant. More than 30 years. And finally, 1 sentence. The Black Rain drug crew once believed that fear could control the future. But the future arrived anyway. And it carried the past with it.